Hello and welcome to another edition of Razorwire. We're going to be talking today about the cost of being a CISO, or CISO dilemmas, however you want to kind of term it. What does a CISO do? How do they work? What's the tips and tricks of the trade? What's it like being a CISO? What are the things you need to watch out for? You know, what's the good, the bad, the ugly? Well, this is the first of a two-parter episode. And I would like to take you through the journey of the world of CISOdom. So without further ado, let's introduce the guests. And today, in order to discuss the cost of being a CISO, and this is only part one of a two-parter, I have two of my favorite co-hosts, really. They're less guests now and more co-hosts. I'm sure they'll probably be very ecstatic to hear that. I have Richard Cassidy and Oliver Rochford. Do you want to do an intro? Is it worth it? Or people should know who you are by now?
Hey, why not? I mean, you'll have lots of new listeners, I'm sure, James. But Richard Cassidy, field CISO at Rubrik, and have been in the game for about 26 years, mainly on the cyber side. So deep cyber security solutions selling to investigations and SOC ops and all these things. So good to be back, as always.
Yeah, Oliver Rochford. I used to be an industry analyst, used to do the SIM Magic Quadrant. And I have my own advisory company called the Cyberfuturist. I work with a number of different vendors, Auguria, N8N, Hunter Security. Generally, I work with these companies in various, talking about how the market is evolving, looking at what kind of future trends are coming up, especially as it relates to cybersecurity operations and AI.
Thank you both for coming. Right, so the cost of being a CISO. So today we're going to be kind of like discussing all things CISO. I think in the last 10 years, there's been lots of various definitions that have been pushed out there about what a CISO is and what they do. That has obviously changed over time, as things tend to. And we are starting to see quite a significant change in that particular role, where it sits, where it stands, who it reports to, that kind of thing. And so we're going to discuss that and what the cost is of being a CISO. Because again, a lot of newcomers to InfoSec, they either normally want to be a penetration tester. That's the big one that a lot of the young techies want. But then there's a lot of people who want to end up being a CISO. And having known many CISOs and been a CISO myself, it's tough. And you've got to have very thick skin. So we're going to discuss it. We're going to go over it. But first and foremost, because we do have a lot of people who are business leads, C-suites, as much as CISOs and as much as newcomers, best thing really to do is to define what a CISO is in today's kind of language and based off of today's work. So, Richard, you are the current standing CISO because I'm an MD at the moment. Do you want to kind of explain to the listeners what is a CISO? What are they there to do?
Yeah, it's been an interesting role. I mean, I've been an advisor to CISOs previous to being what's now a field CISO, but even where I am, I still build policy around a lot of regulation, internal regulations, things like this. And I've met a lot of CISOs, and I ask almost all of them, what's your role? What do you do? What do you focus on? What keeps you up at night? And I guess I can distill it into kind of this, right? So a CISO today is essentially a senior executive that is responsible for designing, implementing, and overseeing any organization's cybersecurity strategy. Okay, but it has significantly evolved from what used to be the old IT security director, from simply managing technical security operations to actually acting as a key business partner, right? And by being a key business partner, what I mean by this is balancing risk and compliance and security, whilst, and this is the hard part, aligning with organizational goals. And so, if I was to distill it down into kind of a couple of high-level points from all the CISOs spoke to, from the role that I occupy, first and foremost, CISOs are, I say first and foremost, you can put these into any order you wish. One is we're normally meant to be business leaders, all right? So not just technical guardians as we used to be seen, but real strategic business leaders. And that means executing security measures that align with business objectives, as I said earlier, and regulatory requirements. Let's be clear on that. The next point is we also see ourselves as risk managers. And we really are risk managers at heart. I mean, we're trying to navigate a very fine line between securing the organization and allowing innovation to flourish. And that's a really tricky line to balance for various reasons. And then the other kind of couple, again, because when I was thinking about this podcast about how to summarize it, it's these as well. Crisis manager. I don't think there's going to be a CISO out there that won't have to deal with a crisis in the organization at some point in their tenure. And average tenures based upon research are not where they used to be. 18 to 24 months, I believe, is the current figures. But CISOs are crisis managers. They're responsible for orchestrating the defense against cyber incidents and leading that response when something inevitably goes wrong. But here are the final pieces where CISOs probably don't see themselves but should, but where I've seen a lot of CISOs kind of start to morph into, is a culture builder. Right, building a culture of security across the organization is super important. So CISOs are more educators than they ever were, shaping how employees and business view and handle security. And now CISOs are compliance navigators. I've lived the compliance life for the past 12 months here at Rubrik, not just for us as a business, but also our customers. And it's all about regulation alignment, right? Navigating those myriads of directives, of regulations, yada, yada, yada. And I think my final point is digital trust enabler. And what I mean by that is, as we really see ourselves as the gatekeepers of digital trust. And let me put the lens on that I really want the listeners to understand. Digital trust enabler is about making sure customers, employees, stakeholders have confidence in the organization's ability to secure data and be resilient in the face of an inevitable failure of those services or third-party systems, et cetera, et cetera. So there you go. A lot have shifted dramatically, but that's where I see and have spoken to other CISOs about where they see themselves.
I spoke to about 3,000 CISOs when I was at Gartner. And when I say CISOs, I have to differentiate, not necessarily the title, but the function, because in different size companies, that can be a different level of person. But I would say it's the most senior security decision maker within the company, depending on what that role is. And absolutely what Richard said, it's an evolving role. There's lots of discussions around where they fit into the structure, how high they go. I think the answer really depends on your vertical, the size of your company, the stage you're at, even the composition of the exec team. It depends on, right? But that's, I think, part of the challenge, the fact that we say CISO, but it can actually be a very different role, from field CISO to, let's say, a CISO for an MSSP to a CISO for a bank. Very different roles, I think, even though they're all packed under one umbrella, because they require a similar set of skills and expertise.
Fantastic. And I totally agree. I mean, I deal with a lot of CISOs with what I do. I've been an auditor for a number of years and done CISO as a service for a number of organizations of different sizes, so as the rest of my team. And I would agree with all of that. I mean, where do you think kind of like we are at the moment from a kind of a reporting perspective? Because, I mean, you go back 10 years, you were usually kind of reporting to the CIO. If you were lucky, you might get the sort of head legal director or possibly finance, but it was predominantly seen as a kind of an IT-based role. And Richard, you made a fantastic kind of summary of how it's migrated now to more of a culture-based thing. There's a lot of kind of policies and procedures. I've always seen it as a risk management, as a significant piece of that role. But I still see, in organizations that I deal with, a lot of resistance, especially if they've got a compliance team, for instance, because they want to maintain control, and quite often they need to maintain control of a number of different compliance requirements outside of just InfoSec. But they're very resistant to allow the CISO to take on some of the more specific compliance, like ISO 27001, PCI DSS, HIPAA, whatever it may well be. What's your analysis from what you've seen at the moment, and where do you think it's going to end up? Do you want to who wants to go first?
When I became a field CISO, and Oliver's right, the CISO is very different depending on the organization you're in. He's 100% correct. And so I went and ordered some books, right? It's the age-old adage, when Google said, when you're asked to jump in a rocket ship, don't ask questions, just get on it and figure it out. When I was asked to take this role, I was like, yeah, okay, this is the stuff I have to learn. So one of the books I read was called The CISO's Handbook. And it's a great book. There's 2 volumes to it. And it had the first chapter in the book was about where do CISOs report, because it's clearly a really important subject. Now, this is an interesting one. So I'm going to give you some snippets on different lines of reporting and kind of how that affects what the CISO can or can't do. And it more affects it in crisis, because when a crisis occurs, a CISO needs ownership, in my experience, of a lot of the different business units to get them to collaborate and respond to the crisis, and where they report can affect that. But let's say if a CISO reports to the CEO, right? Then typically, in my experience, when I see CISOs report direct to the CEO, and it's, by the way, very, very rare that I see this model. Oliver has met a lot more CISOs, I think, than I have, and he may have a different view on it from a Gartner perspective. But my view is this, that signals that security is a top priority, cybersecurity at least is a top priority, and it's integrated into the sort of fabric of the business strategy for a whole different reasons. And then you've got, what if they report to the CIO? Now, what you see there is you get a synergy between IT and security, but I find that can also blur the lines between operational efficiency and risk management, because that's something the CIO tends to own a little bit more, and there can be heads butted when we get to a point where a crisis occurs and decisions need to be made. And then you've got the COO, which is one I don't see too often, thankfully, because I don't feel this is in any way the right place for a CISO to report. But typically COOs, we get directly tied then to business outcomes, reporting, to the heart of operational resilience of the business. The CISO kind of just gets lost in this maze of operating functional outcomes and needs. And it's not the best place for them. And then you've got the CFO. And I would suggest that where I've seen organizations being successful, it's where the CISO either reports directly to the CEO or into the chief financial officer. Because there you typically see a lot more direct board access because of the structure. You get a lot more independence on the CISO side because they typically have greater capability to map those security priorities up to board level and draw budget down as a result of that. I'm not saying they don't in other reporting lines, but it's more effective there. And there is a new role. I say new. It's not the chief risk officer. I've not seen many organizations with this role. I feel the CISO kind of sits in that position. But if you have a chief risk officer, then you're going to get the CISO focused on things that are important, but they're going to dilute some of the importance on the other sort of critical cybersecurity functions. So I'll wrap it up there in terms of my view and my experiences. But I think personally, the CISO should be to the CEO and or the CFO. I do believe there's a future. And I'm happy to be corrected if I'm wrong, but it's just an opinion, where a CISO will eventually become a CIO and that role may blend into one. I don't feel CIOs can become CISOs. I think there's too much of a gap to bridge in terms of knowledge and experience. But I've sat with CISOs and said, could you become a CIO? And I have yet to have one, from retail organizations to banking to utilities, say they don't feel they could make the jump from CISO to CIO and have that role as one. So it's just an interesting food for thought. But there you go. That's my view on it.
Okay. Oliver, what have you experienced?
Yeah, I completely agree with Richard. He's right, maybe that who you report to is going to have a huge impact on what you're able to do and how much control you have and where the priorities lie. At the same time, I think my observation is that the tragedy really is when they have the wrong constellation for the type of company, because ultimately, for you to have a seat at the board visibility level, how much of what you do on a day-to-day is actually critical for the board to know? And if you think about it, very little. Security operations, what are you going to tell them? How many alerts you've processed? That is not need to know for most board members. And so the question is like, where do you fit into that, where you add the most kind of value? How do you produce output that actually helps these people who probably, where you're not always on the front of their mind, unless they see something on the news or they're asked by an investor or something, right? And I think that's a bigger question. The other thing is like, some of this is necessitated by the vertical you're working in. If you're in a legal company or if you're in a finance company, compliance is going to reign supreme, not just over the CISO, over the entire company. If you're in a more like sales-driven organization, you can imagine security is not going to have a seat at the table. Why? They're in the way. And so I think you have to have the right expectations there, and you need to fit the right type of person and mindset to that role. The tragedy occurs when you have more responsibility than you have authority or control. And I think that ties in with that. If you're thrown under the bus after a breach, but you had no actual ability to change the culture there because of who you reported to, I think that's a problem. You didn't fail at your job, it was an org chart failure. And I think that's something which needs to be taken on board. So I think people need to work out carefully where it's most efficient for them to sit in that org. And that's going to be a different answer depending on the company culture, the industry, even the stage that the company is at. That might change over the lifetime of a company, you know.
I see a lot of the situation changing. I mean, we've got a lot of legislation. I mean, Richard and I have spoken about DORA on other podcasts, and we've spoken about the changes that are going on, you know, with SEC going after, you know, specific CISOs at the moment for failure in security where, you know, yeah, they haven't been successful at the moment, but eventually somebody will be successful, and I think that will set the precedent as well. And with DORA, obviously, you know, it's putting the C-suite swear in the firing line now. If you fail in security, you will be responsible for it. You can complain, you can cry, you can moan, but you're still going to be responsible for it. You know, it's a bit like Negan when he comes out with a baseball bat and says, you know, no matter what you say, you're gonna suffer. And I think what that may do is push a lot more CISOs who are maybe getting a little bit tired of sitting under the CIO, because I still see a lot of them there, you know, saying, well, actually, no, if you're going to put me in charge of this and I'm going to be part of the firing line if it all goes horribly wrong, then I want to have some say in what happens. Because I'll be honest, you know, I've spoken with a number of people in information security roles who are very, very sick of being the ones who get, you know, pointed at when something goes wrong. I mean, we have a long culture in InfoSec of retaining everything that people kind of agree that they're going to accept. You know, if I'm going to accept a risk, blah, 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 and all the rest of it, you get their sign off, you know, or I don't want to do anything about that because I don't see it as a risk. Well, fine, you know, give me some collateral. And then, of course, inevitably something happens and they go, oh, no, I didn't. You should have done your job better. It was nothing to do with me, Gov, you know, and then you pull out your piece of paper. And you have to justify your position. And I mean, I had a nice long conversation with a number of CISOs after I spoke with Janja about burnout. And I spoke this morning, I recorded a podcast with Beck McCowan and sort of Lisa Ventura. And we all discussed this kind of what the psychological toll is on a CISO because of the position that they have. And I honestly think that that's going to push CISOs to not rebel, but push and say, no, if you want me to be responsible for this, then you're going to have to give me a bit more say what goes on. Because I see a lot of neutered CISOs. I see a lot of CISOs who want to do well and they do really well with what they've got. But as you pointed out, Oliver, you know, if you've got a sales-driven organization, they're not going to. They're very reluctant to listen to what the CISO is saying when it's like slow down for a second. Let's just secure this environment before you go barreling ahead. You see it sometimes in software development firms as well, where it's like you're in the way. You know, you're stopping us from getting our software to market. We need it to go to market, and it's like, well, hang on. If we go to market and it gets compromised, it doesn't matter how much marketing material you've put in. Your project is going to be a dead on arrival, you know. So I think that may change. I have seen it changing slightly. Are you seeing a similar kind of thing?
I think the world has shifted for CISOs, or has it? What I mean by that is CISOs now, it's not just about protecting company assets. I fundamentally believe, and a lot of this came out with the CISO of Uber and the trouble that he went through. It's actually about protecting your own reputation now, more so than it ever has been before. And there was a Harvard Business Review I was reading recently that said nearly 70% of CISOs worry about the long-term impact on their career and personal reputation. That those were the key things. They weren't even thinking about family or personal health because that reputation piece is so important to them. And CISOs know that, you're sacrificing personal time, right? You're on call, whether you like it or not, or think it or not. As a CISO, you are on call 24/7. There's very little room for work-life balance. There's more reports to show, CISOs working, ridiculous hours per week, missing personal events due to cyber emergencies. And that's why we have a challenge with CISO hiring. I mean, you go on LinkedIn today, in your region, wherever you're listening in the world to this podcast, there are significant numbers of CISO roles, directors of cyber defense or whatever it may be, because people understand that their reputation's on the line. And unfortunately, you're trying to defend a reputation against often, threats and vectors that you're not going to be able to mitigate. It's just too hard to cover every eventuality and possibility. I say this when I go to a lot of speaking events. It's a kind of a funny anecdote. There was a role back in the Chinese dynasties where there was an individual made responsible, depending on which dynasty they were linked to prevent the solar eclipse. That was their job. And if they failed, they paid the price with their life. And I often find sometimes, not that CISOs are going to pay the price with their life, but that's the kind of job they have. Prevent the breach, right? And thankfully, the world has moved on, and boards now, I feel, realize it's not a preventative measure, although we have to still adopt those. And that's mainly regulation-driven and common sense. It's that things will happen. How can we kind of be more resilient, bounce back, things like this? But yes, I mean, the psychological impact, the personal cost, is the reason why CISOs aren't enjoying the job anymore and why we have a CISO crisis.
Oliver?
It's not like a job where you get a lot of gratitude, let's say that way, or a lot of recognition, right?
You're absolutely right there.
Yeah. You only ever get noticed when something really goes wrong. A lot of things outside of your control. You're obviously not responsible for every individual's clicking in an email, right? And more importantly, you have no control over what you inherit. It's not like you can only pick mature security postures to work for unless you're very fortunate, right? So there's all these factors that come together, and at the same time, there's a lot of things that are part of your job which are FOMO-driven, let's be honest. A lot of CISOs have to deal with the hype cycle in one way or another because constantly people are suggesting it to you, asking about it. You have to basically ride that wave as well. You have to also ride the news cycle because a lot of activities are driven by essentially having to placate the board, investors, or customers about something they've heard in the news. Might have nothing to do with you, but you still have to make the effort and tell them that it has nothing to do with you. And you add all of this up together, it's that core job probably doesn't get as much time as it should until it's too late. And knowing that, imagine going to bed every night, knowing, basically living on a prayer, hoping tonight's not the night.
I've been there.
Yeah, I think but the psychology behind it, I think it can be very, unless you're very you're really optimistic about life, almost to the point of like being a toxic optimist. It's gonna weigh on your mind. It's gonna have an impact on you. And yes, the time demands as well. It's you don't choose when hackers attack. So you're always on. Yeah, I completely agree with Richard. It's not an easy job to do at all. People, I think, underestimate that. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think again, one of the things that I see a lot and have experienced myself is the whole justifying what you're doing. Something you mentioned actually in the lead-in, Richard. Metrics. The board want to know that they're secure. Okay. How do you want me to prove that? I can show you all of the incidents that didn't happen. Well, I can't do that because it didn't happen, so I don't have the detail of that. I can show you how many times we get checked out, by port scanning, and how many kind of phishing emails we've caught. But that's not indicative of how secure we are. That's just saying that some of our defense and depth methods are actually working and they're doing what they need to do. But as we know, security threats, they change over time. It's for another podcast, which I will definitely be talking to you guys about, but the whole deepfake thing at the moment. But going back to it, I think, it's the justification of your role. How do you justify your role to a C-suite that you are putting in adequate protection? Now, sometimes you're lucky, and Richard, as you pointed out, if you're reporting to the CEO, then normally the CEO is somebody who's either experienced something in one of the roles that they've been in before, where they've realized that security is a really important part of protecting the business, especially if you've got shareholders, because the shareholders, they want to see profit and all the rest of it. What they really don't like to see is the company that they own in the news saying, yeah, they've just lost 9 billion records for people's social security numbers. I mean, that's a really bad place to be as a shareholder, because it's like, oh, there you go. And then you have the certain instances where you see, the heads of businesses selling their shares just as it comes out that they've had a really, really big security event. And, so have they been holding on to this, and being a CISO is really, really tough when it comes to that justification. How do you do it? How have you seen it done? How do you, if you are a CISO and you're reporting to the C-suite, no matter where you are, how do you kind of justify your position and try to justify any request for budget? Because that's the other thing I see, a very, very small budget normally for security. One GRC product will pretty much wipe it out. That's it. God help you if you want a pen test.
Again, it's a great question, because it's one I'm really interested in when I speak to the CISOs I meet on a weekly basis. Like, in fact, I sat with a CISO yesterday and I said, so how do you get the board to listen to you? What are your priorities? Now, this is a legal firm, so these priorities are probably slightly different. But again, I captured the data and I came up with kind of a number of key things that CISOs should generally collectively tell me that their interaction with the board is as such, right? So first is they see cyber risk as, they try to educate the board in cyber risk as a business risk, because the board wants to understand fundamentally cyber risk in context of overall business risk. So that includes financial, operational, reputational, and regulatory impacts. And so what the CISOs therefore need to do is provide cyber risk metrics. Now, which ones do you provide? Which metrics frameworks do you use? That largely depends on the industry you operate in. But it has to be something quantifiable. And more importantly, it's showing potential business impact. Because a lot of CISOs that I've spoken to, and even here at Rubrik, we had, with some regulations, we had a scenario where I said, we have to do these things. And if we don't do these things, here is the risk to our business. Here is the potential fines and impact it will have. And here, and what was more impactful was, here are the executives that are going to be called out in failure with these potential regulations that we don't maybe bridge these gaps on. That gets a lot of boards listening very quickly. If you implicate them in any scenario, punitively or fiscally, it's a slam dunk. But a lot of the CISOs that do it well, that I'm talking to, present the metrics, and they say, here's what we have to do. Here's what happens if we don't do it, and here's what happens if we do it. Here's the cost of doing it. Here's the potential cost of not doing it, and away you go. Now, here's what's interesting. A lot of CISOs used to think that by presenting risk like that they would have a get out of jail free card, because if anything happened, they could say, well, I told the board and the board didn't listen. Yeah, but regulation doesn't agree with you there. And that's the problem. And let's give you some examples. So currently, there are no broad, widely enforced regulations that specifically target the chief information security officer, but there is pressure on them and they can be called to account. So the SEC cybersecurity disclosure rule has introduced rules that require public companies to disclose material, cybersecurity incidents, and all that jazz. Now, here's what's interesting to the CISO there. So this rule increases scrutiny on how cyber incidents are managed and disclosed to shareholders and regulators. So if the CISO fails to accurately disclose these things in a timely manner, or if they knowingly withhold information, obviously, about a breach, then fines will not just be on the executives, but they will implicate the CISO. So what's interesting there is if I go back to the board and say, we don't have these capabilities, we're not able to report the data in the way we need to report to the regulators, here's the risk, go and decide. And the board decide not to invest in it. They don't think the breach is going to happen, or they don't feel that data silo is as a high risk as others, for whatever reason. Well, that's not good enough, like I said, in this particular case. GDPR, TCPA says the same. So this is where the challenge comes. It's even if you've presented the risk and the risk hasn't been covered, it doesn't mean your back is covered, because you still are responsible for enforcing this. And that means a lot of CISOs that I'm speaking to, when I say, okay, when that doesn't happen, when you don't get the level of investment you need based upon those metrics, what do? A lot of them say, I look for a new job. I cannot be in a business that knowingly accepts risks that are existential, not just to my career, but the reputation of them and, of course, our customers, and they move on. But what a horrible decision to have to make. What a silly situation to be put in from a board level perspective. I have heard those stories. They are not so many, but they are out there. So to kind of summarize on the point, it's unfortunately, CISOs can only do so much, but unfortunately, if the board don't go on the journey with them, they're not off the hook, and board level indecisions can still directly implicate the CISO. And in fact, I think the final point to make is the whole Uber case. We talked about it earlier, right? Joe Sullivan, right? He was convicted of obstruction of justice, and he had all sorts of charges brought against him. And now, there's still, the jury's still out on kind of what happened there, but it set a landmark precedent that shows that even where CISOs did all they think they could have done, they can still be held personally accountable for criminal acts in a way that they handle what's happened. So I think the Uber case was a game changer, right? It showed that CISOs could face criminal charges if they engage in cover-ups or fail to properly disclose breaches. And Joe Sullivan has his view on what happened there, whether, you can go read that. That's a long story, but make your own mind up on it. But it does show that CISOs can't hide behind boards making bad decisions. They will be implicated even if those bad decisions are made.
If you're a CISO and you're sat there and you know something bad has happened, or something bad is about to happen, or somebody is, the company is breaching some kind of regulation or whatever, what do you do? These are the people who employ you, and these are people who, you can't, you can whistle blow, I suppose, but then you're going to affect your career rather substantially, because then any other prospective employer is going to look at somebody who's whistleblown and gone, well, you did it, and it was good that you did, because obviously that organization shouldn't do it, but now I can't trust you to look after my organization without whistleblowing anyway. And if you don't have an avenue for whistleblowing, what do? You're facing down the barrel of a gun for your career by not disclosing something, and you're being told not to disclose it, and it's morally wrong, or it's legislatively wrong, or both. What do you do?
I'd love to hear Oliver's view on this, but I'll give you mine. That is a horribly tricky situation we put in, and I have no doubt, and I have insights from many CISOs that have been put in that position, because if you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't, right? Because if you go ahead and take the moral high ground, which I would implore all CISOs to do, then what's the likelihood you're going to find your next job quickly? Because there may be boards that feel that perhaps you aren't going to toe the corporate line when it comes to things that are gray areas, right? And then if you don't, then you're literally, you're going to bed at night having nightmares about when is this event going to become public? When are the regulators going to uncover the truth? And then that's a whole different scenario that you're up against now, because now you're dishonest, and which organization is going to want to hire. So it's a tricky one. I don't think there's an answer. The right answer is be honest always, but in practice, it's not the way it works.
Now Oliver can bring out all the skeletons in the closets of the CISOs that he spoke to in the past. Come on then, Oliver. What do you think?
The truth is that you have to ask yourself sometimes what enabling the business means. And so if you're in the type of company who do not give you the resources, they do not listen to you, you know what they're going to do when they get breached. They're going to throw you under the bus. They're already showing you this. They're indicating that to you. They're not taking it seriously. At that point, if you stay around, make sure you get a good parachute, right? That's all I can say. But you're better off if you actually value this as a career. If you feel security is a calling, you probably want to move somewhere else. I guarantee you the majority of people end up in businesses where it's a mix of this. It will depend on how the company is doing. If they're doing, I always joke, when a company is doing well, they don't have time to do security. When they're doing badly, they don't have money. And so as a CISO, you're caught somewhere in between. But I think in reality, if you can't help where companies are at, you can't help what maturity they are. What you need to see is that the company is intent and takes it seriously to improve the maturity. You're not going to go from 0 to 100 overnight. This is going to be a journey. And in the meantime, there's going to be risk. I think how the company deals with that risk and how much of that you shoulder is going to depend on you and those individuals, if I'm honest with you. But if you're not getting the kind of support that you think you need, it's your risk, not their risk. They will make sure of that. In terms of reporting these things up to the executive, I completely agree with Richard. You need to find those. Really, you need to explain to them in business terms what this means. But KPIs, people always focus on KPIs. And if you ask me, those numbers, they become meaningless. You need a good storyteller. It needs to become real to them, not in a FOMO way, but in a way that they can translate. Not we're going to get breached, but all of our outlets won't be able to process credit cards. That's the way to turn it around. It's turning the impact around. And the truth is that if you're very technical CISO, I don't think that's a bad thing. Then you need a sponsor like a good CIO who can turn it into that narrative with you. There's different ways of achieving this, but for me, it's about wanting, you need to see the need of the company to want to improve. People talk about budget. If you manufacture matchsticks, you have a limited budget. They're looking for someone who can do the most amount of risk reduction that's representative of what their peers are doing for that amount of money. That could be that for some people, that's a good challenge. For other people, it's not a good challenge, But if you see the red flags that they're not willing to basically back you or listen to you or take you seriously, you should be able to predict the outcome.
Yeah, I've always been asked, if you're a new CISO, what are your top priorities? And I always say 3 things, but I've added a 4th recently. So now I've said this in previous podcasts. What are you protecting? Where does it sit? Who are you protecting it from? But now the other question I ask is, what's my board cybersecurity knowledge? Because boards, at least a Gartner Insight study just this year said that by next year, 40% of boards will have formal a cybersecurity training program in place for the members, which is great because that underscores the importance of this knowledge gap. But I'd like to start there because to Oliver's point, I want to know, what am I up against? How cyber literate are they? Do they understand the kind of key concepts they need to? And you would all think in this industry, because our kids and friends and everybody knows tech, that boards would know the tech to the level that we do. But it's not the case. Remember, board members are typically from traditional financial and management backgrounds, and they are users of technology, not people that necessarily understand it in detail. So that is one of the most important things. Oliver's right. What did your board know? How literate are they? What battles are you going to be facing, and how do you educate your way out of that problem?
I mean, the truth is that if you don't have executive backing, you will fail no matter what. And that backing is probably the most crucial and important thing. And it's you notice already in the interview process, whether you have a seat at the table or not. If you're not able to speak, because I've spoken to people where they were hired and they were told, yeah, we really take security seriously. And they come in and no other executive does. And so being able to get a feel for that culture, for what the company actually wants to do in the future, that is, I think, really important for a CISO. Up to the board level, they should be at least speaking to someone on the board to see how they feel about it, because they're going to need sponsorship at every level.
I have gone and seen some companies, where the security there and the support for security is second to none because of the board recognizing that securing the business secures their revenue streams, it secures their organization, and it makes sure that their organization will stand the test of time, And then I've been to organizations who, I'll be honest, should know a hell of a lot better, who just ignore it, or they're not interested in it. they've got their own agendas internally, and you sit there and you look, guys, you're heading down a cliff. Can you understand you're heading down a cliff? Oh yeah, no, but we're not interested in seeing your risk management. I don't want to see threats. I don't think there are any threats. I think it's all, if an issue comes up, we'll just deal with it. It's like, no, this is not how this works, And in some cases, it's individuals who declare that they have many, 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 many years worth of experience in compliance, in risk, in whatever their discipline is, and it's dubious because you sit there and you talk and you think, well, you haven't even categorized or even questioned what cyber risks, what information security risks you actually have, because it's not on, and I audit these people. It's not on your risk register. You've got your business risks, you've got your operational risks, and you talk about losing a customer or a key customer or an anchor client or, loss of service from a third party. But none of this do I see any of your security risks. Especially in my role as a QSA, the amount of companies I've failed because they've not even categorized anywhere in their thing that the loss of the ability to run credit cards in order to pay for the services or the solutions or the whatever widgets and gadgets they're creating isn't even in there. So do you realize the potential to your business if you can't run credit cards, or if God forbid you have a breach and you get a fine and then you become a level 1 merchant no matter what you say, and you have to get a lovely, lovely guy like me come and do an audit for you, because you don't get a say at that point as to whether you're compliant or not. It's the auditor that tells you, and the auditor is, in the QSA's standpoint, through the Security Council, sanctioned by Visa and MasterCard and Amex and supported through that route themselves. Your bank is not going to help you. Your bank is going to go, oh, the QSA didn't sign you off. Well, that's just tough, isn't it? You're screwed then. And I think that it's changing a lot. And I think there's a lot more view now that security risks are out there. They're seeing it and they're reading it, and they're seeing their competitors getting in the same situation. There's still a lot of apathy, and funnily enough, I don't think it's really at the small business level, because they wish they could have security, but they don't have enough money to be able to do it, as you pointed out, Richard. At the medium level, you tend to get a lot of questioning as to why they need to do things. They're trying to justify the expenditure, because whilst they do have money for security, they don't have an open checkbook, But weirdly enough, it's at the larger business end. And this is where businesses who should know better, who just don't care about security, they really don't. There's a few out there that do, don't get me wrong. And I'm not saying all big businesses are like that. But the wastage that they go through, the loopholes that you see that information security teams have to constantly jump through to get anything through, because the rest of the business is saying, no, we need to progress, we need to get bigger, we need to sort this out. You can't get in the way. How dare you get in the way? Just sideline you entirely. It's a really, really tough situation to be in. And then even if you're brought in as a consultant, as a third-party consultant, yeah, you're not involved in all the politics. Sometimes it does come in, or you see it playing out and you know what's happening. You've seen it for several times before, especially if a big takeover is occurring and everyone's like, yeah, our company's just been taken over. And it's like, oh, guys, you are in for some serious redundancies in certain areas. No, they've said they won't do that. Yeah, of course. But yeah, it's a really tough situation. And to be honest, I think that the CISO position is a really, really difficult one. I mean, every position is. But at least if you're reporting with the chief financial officer or the chief legal representative, they understand the things like failures in compliance and contractual obligations and the rest of it. If you're reporting to the CIO, they don't give a shit. They care about keeping the lights on and making sure that it's not on their watch that somebody hacks in. It's not their problem if Phil, the sales director, who decides to grab the whole database and run off to the nearest competitor with it, or somebody grab a load of IP. They might care about it from a data perspective, data custodian perspective, but they don't care otherwise than that. So it gets really, really difficult to make any change, especially with the CIO, because all they see is the technical side of it. They don't see the operational side of it. They don't see the policies, the procedures, and they don't normally have the power to implement those kinds of things. There's a reason why in PCI DSS, one of the significant requirements in Requirement 12 is that there is a charter signed off by the board or whoever's in charge, basically, of the organization, that they will understand and undertake security and support PCI DSS, basically, and support the security function within the business. A lot of my customers, I like to point out, do that because we've been dealing with them for many, many years. But when you deal sometimes with the newer customers who are going through PCI for the first time, they don't get that. They won't do it either. And it's like, well, you're not going to pass if you don't do that. And with DORA, I think that's going to change things a little bit.
It's important that we temper the good with the bad here, because I've often found that at least from my conversations, and I'll be interested to see what Oliver's found as well, but the CISO, it's a lonely role. You're often the bearer of bad news, and as we've talked about, not everybody in the organization understands the complexity or the urgency of what's happening, and add to that the lack of resource and support you talked about, James, when before the breach occurred and after the breach. And you've still been held accountable for protect your organization, yet you've not been given the resources to do the job properly. No wonder tenures are, just under 2 years. No wonder, CISOs get exhausted, et cetera, et cetera. But there has to be some good. Remember, if you're going to take a CISO role, you've got to understand what you get into. You really have to understand that, look, the bad is constant pressure and stress, potential burnout, but that's on you. You've got to manage your work-life balance. That you may be jumping from job to job every 2 to 3 years. That's just the way it is. Limited support, and yes, there's personal liability, but you can mitigate these things. You can be front and center mind in the organization. I think the good is you're in a good position, right? You've got strategic influence and leadership, notwithstanding the reporting lines we talked about earlier. So, but fight for those reporting lines. I spoke to the CISO of a food manufacturer headquartered in Liverpool. And she said, I'm reporting to, it was the COO. And I said, okay, what's that? And at the end of the conversation, she said, you're reporting to the wrong, you've got to get out to the CIO. You've got to get to that because you're not getting the support you need, right? So it's on you to build that strategic influence leadership. And that's an exciting project. It's a challenging, dynamic role, right? It's very intellectually stimulating, and it is often very dynamic. You get to work at the bleeding, cutting edge of technology. So if you love staying ahead of new challenges and playing a key role in solving complex problems, that's a great role. And the other final 2 points I think I'll make on the good, because we've been talking a lot about the bad, is there is a high demand for CISOs. I talked about it earlier. And organizations are continuing to prioritize security. So the demand for CISOs are growing. There can be good job security as long as notwithstanding the previous steps we talked about. And I love that. I think CISOs have the biggest opportunity for innovation. We're at the forefront of innovation. We help organizations adopt cutting edge technologies, keep them secure. It's awesome. You're always going to be on that bleeding leading edge of tech, and it's exciting. So if that's what you love, go for it. But just remember, it's on you to build and bridge these gaps that exist today. And if you can't do it in the organization you're in, then as Oliver said, it's time to move on.
I totally agree with you, Richard. And we have been talking about the negative, and it's just suddenly dawned on me that we have, and I'll hand over to Oliver in a sec, but, you don't get into InfoSec unless you love it. It's thrilling. It is thrilling, when and I'm going to swear, when the shit hits the fan and you see all of the kind of countermeasures war games you've been through, that you've put into place and that you've trained into people working and resolving the issue as quickly as possible. It's amazing. It's fantastic. Yes, you're going to be sat in front of somebody of rather significant importance, not long afterwards, to explain what happened and why it happened and how it happened in the first place. but which is not, isn't necessarily the nicest of experiences when you first do it. But yeah, there's a lot to be said. InfoSec it can be a really positive environment. And weirdly enough, it's one of the friendliest I've seen in amongst CISOs as well, because we all have the same problem, and we all like to have a little moan every now and then about the weird idiosyncrasies in our own environments. And just a quick question before I hand over to Oliver. Richard, I know that you're actually a quite a big optimist, How many times have you been called a pessimist?
Actually, very few. I
really?
I genuinely. I mean, there have been those high stakes moments where I'm like, okay, listen, I'm really sorry. These things have occurred. We can't mitigate in the timeframes the business needs. We are going to lose X millions, and it's going to cost jobs. Okay, but I still put an optimistic spin on that, going, but hey, we're going to learn something here, and it's but so I can't be a pessimist, and maybe that's not a great skill, but the other thing I will say as a CISO is if you don't normally have to pay for lunches ever again, which is a perk, and you can find yourself at every driving sports event you want if you play your cards right. So there's other perks of the job, but yeah, James, I've always been an optimist. My glass is always half full. And that's good or bad. Take what you want from it, but I don't want to change.
I've always argued I'm a realist, even to my missus, because when I problem solve at home, I go through the same processes as I do at work. Switch all the emotions off, look at it in the whole cold light of day, and just deal with the situation. She gets really frustrated with me. But anyway, over to Oliver for his thought-provoking final notes on part one.
For me, I think Richard is absolutely correct. Like, CISO is a hard job because you are expected to live in two worlds at once. Three: technology, like security, and business. And I think it's hard for anyone to inhabit all of these worlds equally. And so that's I think one big problem. But I think my closing thing is that, and I have some lovely anecdotes, that if you ever think your job as a CISO is bad, you could be dealing with very different things. Like, I spoke to a French gentleman who had been brought in as a second CISO because the original CISO was unfireable and blocked everything. And he asked me about how to deal with someone like that, because in France they have some older workers who are still unfireable. I spoke to somebody else in South America who said they didn't like scanning for vulnerabilities because their regulator gave them 72 hours to respond, and they didn't have the resources to respond to anything in that time, so they just didn't scan. And then there's the anecdote of the German CISO who couldn't bring any security monitoring software in because the data privacy officer always vetoed it because he didn't understand how it worked. So yeah, your job could be so much worse. That's my optimism. There you go.
Those are brilliant. The first one, I've seen that time and time again, where people have got the old school InfoSec people, the no merchants, as I used to term them. They don't understand the technology. They don't understand the reason. They just say no straight away without even considering what it is. And I've definitely seen a lot of the type who, we don't want to install that solutions because we're quite frightened of what we're going to see. It's like Schrodinger's cat. They don't want to open the box in case the cat's dead. So they just sit there and go, don't know.
At some point it starts smelling, right? I mean,
weirdly enough, that was in my book. That was one of the main chapters. Watch out for Schrodinger's cat, and the other one was Occam's razor. And I've taught that time and time again for up and coming InfoSec people. When you're sat in front of somebody and they're saying, no, it wasn't me at all. I don't know what happened there when that solution or that part of the network went down. And you're like, well, you're one of the only 3 people who've got access to it, and the other 2 were on holiday at the time. So I'm guessing you did do something, and you didn't put it through change control, did you? Yeah, they did. You might not be able to prove it, but they did it.
Now with AI, they have another excuse.
Well, this will be a certainly a discussionary point for part 2 of this. How are things going to change? We've briefly touched on it with some of the legislative changes, But I think next time let's look at that. Where are we going with this role? It is aggressively, as Richard said right at the beginning, changing so dramatically over time that it's getting difficult to predict where we're going to be, especially when you introduce other technologies such as AI and so on and so forth. And human intelligence seems to be the big thing at the moment. But we'll cover that next time.
I want to finish on most people have probably seen The Wolf of Wall Street. Sell me this pen. And I've seen some memes recently which have just summed up this. Sell me this pen. And the answer is, it's got AI.
It's got AI in it. It's a bit like Idiocracy with the whole, what are you feeding the plants?
Yeah.
Oh, we're feeding it. The energy drink. It's got electrolytes. Oh, right. Okay.
But surely selling AI would be to say that you don't need the pen anymore.
And there we go. Look at that. See?
There you go.
Oliver, to bring it back to reality and the Matrix and all these other wonderful possible scenarios. I love it.
Are we going to end up having another argument about being transhuman, singularitarian, and bio? Because
Oliver going to give me my title. I loved it. Like, what am I? A futurist sensation? I can't remember what you said, Ollie.
Singularitarian, aren't you? Singularitarian.
Yes, there you go. Singularitarian. I like it. I think I agree with you. Good man.
And for all of those out there who haven't seen Oliver's AI newsletter, he always likes to bring out what was the last one you brought out? The AI, the guy with the tinfoil hat, the AI doomer or something.
Oh, yes. I always have an AI tribe of the week where we have like digital nomads or AI doomers or, so check it out. I put a lot of effort into those jokes.
Go on, plug it. Go on, I know you want to.
It as well. I love the Curious AI newsletter. It's epic.
Richard did it for you. There you go. You can find him on LinkedIn with it, and it is good. It is good. But anyway,
it's Richard's weekly dose of pessimism. It's Richard's weekly dose of pessimism.
I need it. You need to keep me grounded, Oliver.
I term it as realism. It's realism, But okay, guys, we've gone way over time, and I know you're very busy people, so. Thank you ever so much for coming on board. We'll go and do part 2 at some point in the future, near future, and we'll cover kind of like the other more sort of pertinent towards the future pointing items about the cost of being a CISO. And thank you for listening or even watching the latest edition of Razorwire. It's always good to get feedback. Please feel free to reach out to us. You can reach out to us via LinkedIn or through our website, www.razorthorn.com. If you feel that there's something that we should cover maybe a little bit more in depth, a new topic or something of interest to you or the community at large. We'll even do interviews. If you've got any recommendations or you want us to interview people, we'll reach out to those individuals and see if we can get them on camera so we can ask them the important questions about InfoSec. So it'd be great to see what your feedback is. In addition, I do have a book recently come out, the Cyber Sentinels Handbook, a primer for information security professionals. Now, this book is very much geared up towards professionals at all levels of their career, be they starters, be they newcomers, be they people who've been in it for a little while and maybe looking for a little bit more direction, albeit the older ones looking to maybe reground themselves in some of the more important aspects of the trade that maybe they've forgotten over time. I've had lots of good feedback from a lot of different readers of lots of different levels, so please feel free to get yourselves a copy. We've got the e-copy, we've also got the paperback copy, and if you don't want to spend any money, you can go on Kindle Unlimited and read the book for free there as well. So thank you ever so much again. Look after yourselves, and we'll be seeing you again soon.